Botany at this point was like a video game speed run, except the stakes were human life.
It's experiments over here that changed India's agricultural landscape,
Founded in 1787 by the British East India Company.
which basically means it was the world's biggest and most powerful hedge fund. But Shobna, what is the significance of this particular garden?
Jacob, if you've ever drunk tea,
I have.
if you've worn cotton,
I am.
if you've taken quinine for
Most
malaria,
definitely.
then something from the garden has touched you.
Welcome to the Rare View, where we investigate histories hiding in plain sight. Like that plant in your neighbor's garden, which definitely isn't a tomato. I'm Jacob Koshi.
And I'm Shobana, and we are going into botany mode. But before you roll your eyes, it is far more dramatic than you think. There are kidnappings, there is rivalry, there is global land grab.
And cinnamon. Shobna.
Yes, cinnamon conspiracies.
And hemp and cotton and the world's biggest tree that's also somehow several thousand trees pretending to be one. This is an absolute horticultural whodunit.
We're talking about a garden, but not like a cute backyard situation. This is the Calcutta's Botanical Garden, now the Acharya Jagdish Chandra Bose Indian Botanic Garden, founded in 1787 by the British East India Company.
Which basically means it was the world's biggest and most powerful hedge fund at that time.
Exactly, and that's what makes it fascinating, because the garden, it was not just for love of leaves, it was created out of love of profit. Let's start with what the British needed the most in the late 1700s. Ships, which require wood, lots of wood, especially teak, because it doesn't rot in seawater, unlike the British oak that does. And where will you find?
But they also needed fiber for ropes and sails, and hemp was critical for naval infrastructure, as you were saying. And Europe, being the continent that it was, it didn't grow enough of it. So their expert colonial botanists were told, find us local hemp and fast or the navy sinks.
And then there is the juicy spice story. There is cinnamon, pepper, nutmeg, colonial money plants. And the Dutch controlled the cinnamon trade in Sri Lanka, Ceylon back then, which of course the British hated. So when they found that cinnamon could grow in Bengal, they were happy.
And to add to that, so there's coffee, which is caffeinating the empire. There's cotton, which is fueling the industrial revolution in the textile mills. And there are all kinds of new food crops. And the purpose of that was to, not repeat the devastating effects of the Great Bengal Famine of 1770s. So plants were not, as we've been discussing, they were not just curios or things that you grow in the garden. They were the strategic assets of that time.
Yeah, and it turns out nature was the original defense budget. And the first suspect that we have is Colonel Robert Kidd.
So he's Scottish, he's a military man. He takes this one look around Bengal and thought, what if you could just organize nature into the equivalent of spreadsheets?
Yeah, I mean, the story is a bit more longer than how Jacob puts it. And if I were to take a short detour, he writes to the East India Company talking about how he stumbled across this plant, which has very different foliage than the others. And he realizes it is a cinnamon tree, which had been growing without much care. And that is the pitch that he dangles in front of the East India Company, that if we can have cinnamon trees that can grow here in Bengal without any care, then we beat Ceylon and we make more money.
So he wanted it to be a kind of garden of acclimatization, and this was not just for flowers, but for, weapons-grade agriculture.
Kidd convinces the company by saying food security, profits, low cost, plants that water themselves. Of course, he was overstating that last bit.
But didn't matter. The company actually brought the sales pitch because this was the age of I mean, the emerging age of mercantilism and, the whole seeds of industrial capitalism was just being born. This was a time when trading commodities and goods by the European powers, setting up outposts. This was the age when this was reaching, peak maximum.
And the interesting bit, so Kidd writes to the East India Company. Of course, back then the communication was not as fast as our WhatsApp messages. And even before his communication reaches to the East India Company Board of Directors, sitting in London, the Governor General, he is so excited that he acquires 300 acres of land in Shibpur, across from Calcutta, a strategic spot on the river Hooghly. And of course, the board of directors is very delighted. So their letters practically cross.
And it was a great location. I mean, it was great for boats in terms of the draft available, as well as great for smuggling.
Yes.
I mean, plant exchange, as they would call it.
And this garden becomes like the customs warehouse of botanical world.
So you have plants that are being shipped in from China, Southeast Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, Mediterranean, and Ohio. Somehow, American cotton also makes its entrance over here.
And plants are shipped out from India to the rest of the empire, especially the money-making species, the seeds of empire.
So imagine there are these large wooden crates that are arriving every week. A custom officer opens one. Inside, leaves and roots from lands unknown. And this was it was actually one of those intriguing inventions of the time, because imagine, these are plants and they're traveling intercontinental. The chances of it rotting or withering away were so high. But over time, one of the great inventions was the discovery of these great boxes that could actually hold these
and self-watering.
It was like the herbariums.
Yeah, mini herbarians.
Of course, it was not like now where you can't take where all our Indian brethren always go to the US with their masalas and their plants, and they are promptly told to throw all those things out. These were the golden days when you could just take everything, plants and
your heart
animals.
sinks when that one little achar bottle is thrown out. But
cruel people.
Yeah, absolutely cruel people. Botany at this point was like a video game speed run, except the stakes were human life, because from the whole pitch, or one of the pitch of Robert Kyde was that after the 1770 famine, he pitched it that we'll be able to grow our own crops, even if their crops fail.
He was so wedded to his garden and his herbarium that even, I think even on his, his last wishes were that, I don't want to be buried in a cemetery. I don't want priests officiating. I just want to be buried in my garden. He just literally wanted to be part of the earth that, that had given him all these joyous plants.
But of course, that was not his wish was not agreed upon by those who survived him, and he was buried in South Park Street Cemetery in Calcutta.
But Shobna, what is the significance of this particular garden? Like, why is it so important?
Jacob, if you've ever drunk tea,
I have.
If you've worn cotton,
I am.
If you've taken quinine for
most definitely.
Or if you've seen a rope.
Oh, actually, I haven't seen a rope in the garden.
Such deep conversation we are having. But any of this, if you've done, then something from the garden has touched you.
And botanical experiments like these were the literal nursery for what was to come in India, because the British all saw India as this, Garden of Eden for a range of agricultural products. So the reason why it was a jewel in the British crown was, the variety of microclimates that allowed the creation of so many different kinds of plants. And it's experiments over here that changed India's agricultural landscape, ecological flow, the ecological balance, and kind of the global trade flows that even influence the world as of today.
So Kidd plants the first seeds, literally, but he doesn't get to see the garden become the botanical powerhouse that he had imagined it to be.
So our next main character, that is Dr. William Roxburgh, arrives. Roxburgh is a successor, and
He's also Scottish.
also Scottish. And I guess that explains their love for systematizing everything. So his whole plan was to say, let's do this properly.
He was a trained botanist and he loved organizing stuff. He was a little more than your usual garden enthusiast who looks at a plant and says, oh, future rope.
And garden enthusiast who loves documentation. I
Yes.
mean, the guy who wants to dot every comma and thing. And here he's, right from the, from the Isles of, from the Highlands of Scotland, he's come down and he's obsessed in this, with plants and, mosquitoes and humidity.
So, from being a garden, now this is a center of the Indian botany, Indian subcontinent, in fact, whole of South Asia, practically,
And
under
he changed
Roxburgh.
the whole commercial aspect of it, and he made it into a proper scientific institution.
But that has been, Jacob, the eternal tug of war between the company and those who managed the botanical
Because
garden.
Kidd was quite clever in that, he had sold the idea of collection as, hey, this is going to be profitable. But though he himself in his mind, I guess, was scientific and all those things.
Exactly. And that had been the tussle. And that is a recurrent theme that we will see as we proceed in our story.
So he expanded the plant collection from about a few hundred species to several thousand, and several of them were completely unknown to European science. He actually commissioned and even personally prepared a lot of paintings and drawings of these, of these illustrations, which are extremely gorgeous and detailed and scientifically precise.
Yeah, but what is important to underline here is that most of this work was done by Indian artists, and we have to appreciate that they had drawn every vein of the leaf so well and so accurately that even hundreds of years later we are able to tell which plant.
There's this whole tradition of company art, as it's called, where there were several times Indian painters, who actually had their skills in the miniaturist tradition, but, they were commissioned by the British into drawing not just, profiles and portraits of, nobles and princesses, but even stuff like these. And several of this actually exists today in, in very well curated exhibitions.
Jacob, Roxburgh is important also because he is known as the father of Indian botany. He wrote the first sort of collection of identifying the various species called the Flora Indica.
And he also had this contribution where he suggested that, plants like the jackbread fruit be introduced in India. And so that during years of famine, they could be easily cultivated and, could be, used, for sustenance. It was the equivalent of how, in Kerala, one later on started to export the Brazilian tapioca, which is now like a staple food, kappa, in, today, and was not just those, it was not seen as one of those food that you eat during famine. So jackbread fruit actually is even cultivated in the Caribbean. I mean, it was not very popular.
It was introduced by the colonial masters.
Yeah, so it was all part of this. So India, like in other colonial outposts, were places where, they were experimenting with the uses of different kinds of, plants for different purposes.
But Jacob, I want to now quickly skip to the person who stays as the superintendent of the Calcutta Botanical Garden for 3 decades. And he puts Calcutta Botanical Garden on the world map.
Yeah.
And he is this really interesting character called
Nathaniel Wallich.
Now, Wallich, I find, is a really interesting character. He is a Danish fellow who joins the Danish East India Company, and he comes to India as a Danish East India Company employee. But in 1808, this is the famous time when the British and the Danes are fighting each other, and the British sort of conquer one of the Danish factories, but it's all hunky dory between the Danes and the Brits, and they allow at least the top officers to join the East India Company, and Wallich is one of them.
So he was actually first taken as a prisoner of war
Yes.
by, when they, I guess, attacked the fort at the Danish fort at Serampore. But I guess his talents were
Yeah, recognized back then also.
by Roxburgh.
So he worked as a Roxburgh's assistant for a while, and later on he took over as the superintendent.
And his great ambition is to collect everything, anything that can grow above the ground below it.
Greedy. I mean, he's ambitious and he's greedy. He wants everything. If it has roots, if it is poisonous, if it is claimed by another botanist, Wallich wanted it. And his career goal was simple: collect, collect, collect.
Within a few years with the British, he's running all kinds of expeditions. He's on an expedition to Nepal, then to where, all the stunning mountain flora was just music to his eyes. I know that's a terrible mixed metaphor.
Yes.
But then he goes to Burma and all the tropical places like the Straits of Malacca, and he's just collecting plants from everywhere and literally bringing them to the whole scientific classification process that is called European botany.
Yeah, and under Wallich's time, the seeds and plants are traveling like gossip at a family wedding.
Thanks to him, the garden becomes like extremely well known. It becomes like the mecca for anybody who's interested in plants and botany.
And one thing is there, while Wallich is very greedy about collecting plants, and I don't find that something bad in that. We all need to be greedy about our work. He was equally generous. No matter who wrote to Wallich, without any introduction, but if that person seemed invested enough, Wallich would send them a little seed, a little sample, and he was very kind that ways.
Yeah, that is such a very, very true scientific spirit kind.
But whether he was kind to us, as a country, whether that generosity was dangerous to us.
Well, they were East India Company people, so you can't expect much goodness about them. But this exactly was, he just wanted to be the person who found something. But once once his name was attached to it, it didn't really matter to him, whether he kept possession. He wanted fame and recognition, which is why he wanted to be the source of information of plants.
So the other interesting thing about Wallich is that he used to fall because he used to go for these great expeditions and all the time. So obviously his health was not in such a great condition, and he would take long medical leaves, but he expected to hold on to the position and he expected to get the company allowance. And at one point, the board of directors took offense and said that, company employees should not be.
I think he went on like 18 1-year-long and 2-year-long leaves,
yes,
right?
And that brings us, that's a beautiful segue to reach to the story that we wanted to talk about. So Mr. Wallich says that he is unwell and he wants to recuperate, and the Indian doctors cannot help him. He needs a complete change of environment, and he leaves for England.
Wow.
Except
he's not alone.
He's not alone.
And he carries more than his clothes and his quills.
Yes. He has 8,000 plants.
Oh my God.
From the Botanic Gardens Museum. These are the dried species, and he's packed it into crates, and he's taken one assistant with him.
I'm just imagining the retinue of, of laborers and, assistants who are like, can you imagine he's just going to the railway station, eventually to the boat, and there's this army of people with 8,000 boxes. What a scene that would have made.
Yeah, imagine carrying an entire natural history museum in your suitcase. But the Wallich's idea was that basically he wanted to catalog these plants, and he thought that he will not have the time, the energy, and the intellectual support here in India, and that is why he had taken the whole set out.
And the linear system of classification was now the dominant form of like distributing and categorizing everything.
Yeah, which was again very racist way of looking at the world.
Yeah, especially when it came to the human beings, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So we never remember these things about, like, we all think of Carl Linnaeus and, the Linnean society, but, the other darker aspects of these scientists in terms of how they imagined and ended up creating all these stereotypes that remain even today. Some of those things are literally unforgivable.
Yeah, you have the Jew bush and the Kafir
Lime.
So, but, Walsh did contribute to the garden because in 1828 he informed the government that the number of plant species had doubled since 1812, and the number of specimens received by the museum over 7 years now numbered over 6,000. And on top of this, there were some 1,200 drawings of individual plants, most of which were previously unknown to the European.
Eventually, in London, he creates what is called the Wallich Catalogue today, which lists some 9,000 different species. And he's also giving away different duplicates to European collections, because there is this whole obsession in Europe with collecting stuff from all across the world. People want their own private, collections of things, I guess, like watches and stuff like that today.
Also, this is the time when all the palm trees enter the London drawing rooms, and there is that famous story of the Kew Gardens in London, which precede the Calcutta Botanical Garden, where Queen Victoria, who had never ever visited her empire, would visit the Kew Garden quite regularly.
That was her understanding of this is how
her connection to the empire.
Her connection to empire.
So Wallich was the superintendent from 1817 to 1846, with long spells of leave in between, as we just spoke about. But in 1846, finally his health gives in and he has to resign from the position. But he continues his work as a botanist sitting in London. So Wallich did create a lot of heartburn because he had, literally stripped clean the Calcutta Botanical Gardens collection. Obviously, it did no longer, by the mid 19th century, its importance had fairly dimmed, but it continued to hold a place.
And again, and after his time, that whole commercial aspect of all these plants and their uses to, what could you do with all these interesting plants started to, surface again. So, for example, we have the history of hemp. They wanted plants which could be useful, which could be traded, or, and this was what was drawing everybody to Bengal. So, hemp was the super fiber of the 18th and 19th centuries.
So, because if you're trying to sail the world and extract resources with maximum efficiency, what do you need at that point? You need giant ropes, you need giant sails, and zero snapping in storms.
And the British discovered that Russia, which was the original source of such wonderful, useful hemp, was an inconvenient partner to trade with because it was also growing in
its
ambition.
It had its own imperial ambitions.
So everybody is looking to the garden.
The British once again look towards the garden and give the direction: grow us ropes, grow us sails, grow us dominance on the high seas.
So there are these hemp trials. They were tested out systematically with various sections. You're seeing which were the best soil types where hemp could be grown. What is the best watering regimes? What are the best retting techniques in terms of, twisting them and making the strongest kind of ropes? Was it good in monsoon? Was it good in seawater? It was the most systematic investigation of crop.
And there is another crop that the British industry is very thirsty. That is cotton. Yeah. So Manchester factories are spinning like crazy and turning thread into empire.
Now, India, of course, has its own long tradition with cotton, but these are short. They're not. They're meant for hand weaving. They were not, as you said, they were not really suitable for the industrial looms of Manchester.
In the early 19th century, the company decides that it is time to import cotton seeds from America.
And if something grows in the Mississippi humidity, maybe it's good for Bengal too.
Yeah, but of course, the early trials are very chaotic. The seeds are confused, the soil is annoyed, farmers are unimpressed.
American Cotton was like, who are you? This isn't what my agent promised.
But the British officers mapped the cotton zones on paper. They ignored the farmers' expertise. They ignored the community crop cycles, soil knowledge, and the soil knowledge that has been passed through generations.
Plants are also whimsical. They don't really follow spreadsheets, right? So every garden's success, everything that actually grew the way they hoped it to, became a new industry, and everything that was a failure was back to the planning table.
Yeah. But their questions were still the same. Can this plant exist in India? Can this plant bring us some money?
And so the garden again became like this agricultural innovation center, trade strategy hub. It had become again this, it occupied this interesting position where here is a collection of everything. Let's start experimenting with the best. It's like a startup.
A botanical startup incubator. And of course, there was teak, which we spoke about how they originally needed it to build their ship.
And that was a superstar. It was rot resistant, termite resistant, and eventually a lot of there was teak that was being grown in several parts of South India.
One of the best experiments, and maybe perhaps one of the best gifts that this garden has given to us and to the world, is the Indian tea. Now, this was an experiment that flourished. The sapling came, it was smuggled from China, grown and perfected in the botanical garden, and that is why we have those lovely, beautiful tea gardens across Assam, Darjeeling, and the other parts of the country.
And Britain was obsessed and addicted to tea, and there was
their treasury was draining because of tea. That's another story for possibly another time.
Opium story and the trade wars, which is like
the tea versus opium story.
It was this tea that was actually cultivated and perfected in India, and from the herbarium's initial collections, and that again became a major source of export.
But of course, while we are talking about all this economy, botany being used for business, the Indian farmer were obviously facing a tough time.
And finally, how can we forget the great cinchona bark? I mean, here was, Imperial Britain, which was colonizing Africa, which had colonized India, and their armies were making vaster inroads, but being felled by malaria and all sorts of tropical diseases. And we had that whole episode on Ronald Ross. And here was yet another plant that, from South America, they discovered that this was a plant that the bark of this tree, the cinchona tree, could actually be an anti-malarial agent because it gave that powerful agent called quinine. And here it was again cultivated by India, and I'm sure it was also part of the herbarium and its experiments. So here it's had this very rich tradition. It inspired Indian forestry, the whole plantation culture. And, another major modern day consequence of it is, just as it was a collection of all kinds of species, today, we have institutions in Delhi, like the National Institute of Plant Genome and Research, which also similarly hosts every kind of plant that is being discovered in India, including its germplasm, which is frozen. It's like, in Norway, you have the Svalbard, the Svalbard collection, which basically is a collection of all the important a plant species that are buried deep under ice. Because what if the world ends in a cataclysm, by some nuclear war or
Like a
something?
Noah's Ark.
It's like a Noah's Ark. So many of this, so the Calcutta Garden was like an initial, it seeded the idea of these kinds of arcs that are now present all over the world today where they host this. But how does the tropical botanical garden scene look today, Shobna?
Jacob, there is one living organism in that garden which probably, at least holds some memory of the time that it was established. It's the 250-year-old banyan tree.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So imagine walking under a tree which is so vast, it feels like a forest pretending to be a single tree. The shade is so heavy, it cools you down as if you've walked into another world. That is the great banyan tree of the garden, which is 250-year old. Its aerial roots, thousands of them, descend like tentacles, thicken into trunks, branch out, root again. And what was once one tree has now become a wood masquerading as a tree.
So we've gone through this entire journey across continents and geographies, and we have settled down on this great majestic tree. And that's all we have today, Shobna. I'm just going to relax in the shade of that banyan tree in my mind, and we shall come back soon in the next episode with more interesting stories. I'm Jacob Koshi.
And I'm Shobana Nair. Stay curious, stay kind, and stay tuned to The Rare View.
So we shall be taking a short end of the season break, and we shall be back next year with more episodes and more forays into the world of Indian history and science.